We trust experiments to be harmless. But in 1971, a Stanford study meant to last 2 weeks spiraled into cruelty and chaos and had to be shut down after just 6 days. Power can creep up on people. Students who volunteered as guards were given uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, and authority, while prisoners were arrested at their homes by real police, stripped of names and dignity, and forced into degrading routines. The setup turned roleplay into real suffering almost overnight. Situations shape behavior more than we like to admit. Some participants had emotional breakdowns and were released early. Researchers watched their own experiment unravel, and the fallout rewrote the rules for how research is done and how institutions protect people. It's easy to shrug and say that was a long time ago. In this video, we revisit the arrests, the moments that went too far, and the ethical aftermath using footage and first-hand accounts so you can see how ordinary people and ordinary settings can produce extraordinary harm, and why that still matters today. 1. In 1971, Stanford University launched a psychological study simulating a prison environment. A handful of college students showed up at a university basement, and the setting began to feel real almost immediately. The study was run by Philip Zimbardo at Stanford in 1971, and researchers had recruited volunteers from an initial pool after screening them for physical and mental health. 24 men were chosen and paid for their time. Some were randomly assigned to be guards, others to be prisoners, and the randomness mattered because it stripped away pre-existing identities. The design looked simple on paper, but the details, uniforms, numbers, and a locked environment did most of the work. The prison was built inside the psychology building with cells, bars, and a processing area, and participants were processed like arrestees before they arrived. Local police cooperated by arresting some volunteers at their homes and bringing them in for booking, which added a layer of realism that academic instructions could not reproduce. Prisoners were issued smocks, ID numbers, and caps, while guards received uniforms, whistles, and reflective sunglasses that hid their eyes. Those concrete props helped create de-individuation. When names disappear and numbers and uniforms replace them, behavior follows the script. The day-to-day routines pushed small behaviors into larger patterns very quickly. Guards invented routines, punishments, and privileges to maintain order, and those routines escalated from barking orders to psychological harassment in a matter of hours. Prisoners grew passive, confused, and in some cases distressed, showing emotional signs that the environment had real effects on people who had only been acting roles. The interaction between role cues and lack of oversight produced consequences nobody on the original team had fully predicted. The experiment was meant to last longer but was stopped early when outside observers objected to what they were witnessing. Zimbardo himself was acting as the prison superintendent, which blurred the line between observing and participating and made it harder to correct course. The study's rapid escalation and its premature termination became a concrete example in debates about research ethics, shaping how oversight and participant protection are handled in human subject research. 2. Volunteers were assigned roles as guards and prisoners in a basement setting. You could feel the air tighten as soon as you walked into the basement. Low ceilings, concrete floors, and a narrow corridor that split the space into cells and a small guard room. The setting was built to feel like a real institution inside a university psychology department basement, with barred doors, small cots, and a communal area that functioned like a yard. Men who had volunteered for a study were then sorted into 2 groups by chance, and that random assignment put them into sharply different roles. Once the labels guard and prisoner were attached, the physical layout started to do the work of a system. There was a quiet authority in how the guards were outfitted: khaki shirts, whistles, mirrored sunglasses, and a whistle-changed posture. They were given broad instructions to maintain order, not a detailed script, and that combination of uniform and vague mandate encouraged improvisation. One guard might set strict schedules and count prisoners obsessively, while another focused on petty rules like how a prisoner folded a blanket. Those small choices added up fast, because the equipment and the role sanctioned them. Being a prisoner meant losing ordinary markers of identity. Men wore smocks and stocking caps and were referred to by ID numbers instead of names, which made common interactions feel clinical and one-sided. Daily routines included roll calls, confined sleeping spaces on narrow cots, and regulated meal times served from metal trays in a communal area. The material details, chains at some moments, the thin mattress, the clink of a gate, made compliance easier and resistance harder. Because the assignment was random and the environment reinforced it, behaviors escalated in predictable ways. When guards began imposing arbitrary punishments or inventing rituals to assert control, prisoners reacted by becoming more passive or by pushing back in small, desperate ways. Emotional strain followed, and the combination of props, authority, and anonymity produced consequences that unfolded quickly and visibly in that basement. 3. Within days, participant behavior shifted sharply and pressure inside the prison escalated. Authority showed up fast. The men chosen as guards slipped into uniforms, sunglasses, and whistles, and they began to act like people who actually had the right to order others around. Small choices turned into habits, waking prisoners up early, assigning bunk search routines, and insisting on rigid head counts. Those little rituals gave the guards permission to expand their control, and expansion followed naturally from having a role to fill. The everyday punishments were concrete and often petty. Guards started calling prisoners by assigned numbers instead of names, enforced silence for long periods, and imposed group penalties when one person stepped out of line. A few guards created an improvised solitary by locking a man alone in a closet-like space for hours. Verbal humiliation and public ordering, making someone repeat phrases, stand in certain poses, or perform degrading tasks, became tools to remind prisoners who was in charge. Pressure built on the prisoners in predictable ways. Many stopped arguing and became inwardly focused, answering less, keeping to themselves, and following orders with numbed compliance. Others pushed back. A handful organized a hunger strike and refused to comply until the guards reacted with stricter rules and extra searches. Emotional breakdowns followed for some. Tears, anger, and panic showed up in people who had been calm at intake, and several participants were removed because they could not cope with the stress. Power and resistance fed one another, and the situation intensified quickly. Every act of rebellion earned a harsher response, which then justified tougher guard behavior, and that cycle ratcheted up the pressure inside the mock prison. The result was a crowded, tense atmosphere where small decisions, who sits where, who answers, who sleeps when, mattered enormously and pushed ordinary college students into extremes of submission and cruelty. 4. Observers recorded deteriorating conditions for some prisoners and harsher guard conduct. When volunteers donned uniforms and ID numbers, the people watching started to notice small changes that kept getting worse. Observers, research assistants, and other staff logged incidents in notebooks, noting that a few prisoners began to withdraw, cry, and complain of headaches and stomach pain. The unrest didn't stay private. It showed up in stretched faces, sleepless nights, and increasingly frank reports of anxiety. At first, those signs were written off as stress from role-playing, but the mood hardened and some participants asked to leave. One subject, identified in study records as 8612, showed severe emotional distress and was released early after uncontrollable crying and rage. Others reported panic, loss of appetite, and a sense of humiliation that made them stop engaging in routine tasks. Observers documented these specific reactions and recorded them as evidence the situation was deteriorating rather than normal discomfort. Observers also tracked a steady escalation in guard behavior, from by-the-book rule enforcement to coordinated humiliations. Guards began using sunglasses, uniforms, and batons to create distance and authority, then moved on to confiscating names, assigning degrading tasks, imposing solitary confinement, and deliberately interrupting sleep and meals. Some guards organized staged punishments and invented petty rules that they enforced zealously. Notes from the observation team show that a handful of guards seemed to take real pleasure in exerting contra. 5. The study was ended early and later became central to debates on research ethics and role effects. It took a visitor's alarm to bring the simulation to a halt. A graduate student who toured the mock prison confronted the lead researcher after watching participants cry, scream, and beg for mercy, and her direct objection forced a re-evaluation on the spot. Several participants were showing clear signs of psychological distress. Because those reactions were immediate and observable, the team had to stop the activities sooner than planned. That abrupt ending opened a torrent of ethical questions across universities and journals. Institutions began asking whether the procedures had adequate safeguards, whether informed consent truly prepared volunteers for the risks, and whether a researcher who plays both investigator and prison superintendent can remain impartial when harm appears. Protocols were rewritten as a result. For example, oversight bodies started insisting on independent monitors and explicit stopping rules that must be followed if harm appears. The study's premature closure also fueled intense debate about the power of situational roles versus individual dispositions. Supporters pointed to the swift descent into abusive behavior as evidence that situational pressure can overwhelm personal morals, while critics noted that the researchers' involvement and the escalation of actions before termination made it hard to separate authentic role effects from experimental demand and scripting. Replication attempts and alternative investigations have since tested those competing explanations, showing that group identity, leadership cues, and study design all shape outcomes. Today, the dramatic shutdown is taught as a concrete lesson for designing human subject research. Ethics boards now commonly require detailed risk mitigation plans, mandatory debriefing, mental health follow-up, and the presence of independent observers who can halt a study without negotiating with the principal investigator. Its legacy is mixed. The early termination remains a cautionary example that led to stronger protections and a more nuanced conversation about how roles and situations shape behavior. You probably felt a knot in your stomach watching those clips. It started as a simple classroom study, college students paid to play guards and prisoners in a mock jail, but because uniforms, ID numbers, closed doors, and assigned authority nudged behavior in predictable ways, the setup pushed ordinary people into cruel routines, punishments, and emotional collapse. Guards enforced arbitrary punishments. Because the lead researcher also stepped into an authority role and because the setting removed normal checks and balances, alarms went off inside the study and it was stopped early, a moment that led to big changes in how research is reviewed and regulated. It hits close to home when power is taken for granted. When students in a basement room began acting like jailers, it showed that context shapes actions. The layout of a room, the costumes people wear, and the rules they're given can turn small privileges into real harm, which is why prisons, workplaces, and online platforms must pay attention to design and oversight. Concrete reforms followed. Because the harms were visible and public, institutional review boards, clearer informed consent, and stronger ethical standards became a part of research culture. You might wonder what to do with this unease. Holding that discomfort matters because it pushes questions about accountability, about how institutions create behavior, and about when observers should intervene. And those questions are exactly why we keep revisiting these cases and why ethics keep changing. If you want to explore more, there are related episodes and archival interviews that go deeper. In the next video, we'll examine Milgram's obedience study and modern re-examinations that try to separate person from situation. And if this raised questions for you, there are first-hand accounts and expert conversations linked for those who want to keep looking.